The water had barely lapped over the upper decks of the battlecruiser Australia before her successor was being ordered. Without a clear threat requiring a capital ship, the next flagship of the Royal Australian Navy would carry on the name, but would instead be a cruiser, later to be designated a heavy cruiser in subsequent naval treaties. Along with her sister HMAS Canberra, the new HMAS Australia was a member of the County class, specifically one of the first 7 ships, often classified as the Kent subclass. Ordered in 1925, she was laid down in the summer of the same year and launched in spring 1927. She commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy in April 1928, having been constructed, like her predecessor, at John Brown's shipyard on the Clyde. As the flagship, even though she entered service on the eve of the Great Depression, she remained in service, one of only 3 Royal Australian Navy warships to remain continuously in service during this time period, taking part in several years of cruising duty, visiting various nations around the Pacific. This was followed by an almost 2-year-long exchange program that saw the ship serve in the Mediterranean Fleet, while a corresponding Royal Navy County class served in Australian waters. More cruising was undertaken upon her return, but rising tensions across the world, exemplified by Australia being part of the fleet prepared to fight the Italian Navy during the Abyssinian crisis while she was in the Mediterranean, led to the first of several refits and upgrades being undertaken in 1938. This doubled the secondary battery from 4 to 8 heavy anti-aircraft guns by replacing the single 4-inch mounts with twins. Additionally, she received a full-length 4.5-inch thick armour belt, replacing the box protection she'd had previously, proving, as with most of the County class, to be surprisingly, one might even say suspiciously, capable of accepting the 400 to 450 extra tons of armour plate that these upgrades involved without any significant impact on her seakeeping. The outbreak of World War II saw the Australia, Canberra, and the light cruiser Sydney form a powerful hunting group that went looking for the heavy cruiser Graf Spee in the Indian Ocean, even whilst the famous scrap iron flotilla of destroyers was heading for the Mediterranean, also hoping for such an encounter. Once that threat was past, she spent the first half of 1940 escorting troop convoys before moving into the South Atlantic, the Royal Australian Navy having offered her services to the Royal Navy, where she continued in the convoy escort role before joining the attack on the French battleship Richelieu at Dakar. After a brief stint with the Home Fleet, it was back to the west coast of Africa and more duels with the Dakar defences. Once this operation was over, it was back to the UK again for a refit. Whilst she was in dry dock, a German aircraft apparently attempted to torpedo her, but dropped the F-5W aerial torpedo parallel to her in the drained dry dock, thus accomplishing absolutely nothing. Presumably the torpedo bomber had been aiming for the dry dock gates and had just dropped the weapon a little bit late. After more convoy escort work in the Atlantic, the ship was back in the Indian and Pacific Oceans by spring 1941, and it was here that news of Japan's entry into the war was received, prompting her to sail for home. Since most of the Royal Navy presence in the area had been withdrawn earlier to the Mediterranean, and after Operation C, the Indian Ocean Raid, and the annihilation of ABDA Command, the Royal Navy was mostly restricting itself to the Indian Ocean from Ceylon westwards, the Royal Australian Navy decided to operate alongside the US Navy, the nearest substantial Allied forces to Australian home waters. This initially meant mostly being part of escort formations for US carriers, which included a peripheral role for the ship in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Task Force 44, as the mixed Royal Australian-US Navy formation was now known, was next assigned to cover the landings on Guadalcanal, under the command of Admiral Crutchley, who as a captain had led HMS Warspite into Narvik. Anticipating a Japanese night attack, the force was deployed accordingly, but then the US Admiral Turner summoned Crutchley and the Australia for a conference, the result of which was the Allied formation lacking its flagship and admiral when the Japanese Navy under Admiral Mikawa showed up and destroyed most of the task force. Australia was subsequently reassigned to carrier escort and patrol until the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, and then it was back to patrol and convoy escort duty before the reconstituted group was renamed to Task Force 74, which was gradually folded into the US advance, first operating as screening ships, then as direct escorts, and then on the front lines conducting bombardment missions. This saw out 1943 and 1944, which opened with a refit that increased her light anti-aircraft firepower, after which Task Force 74 was used aggressively in further landing operations in the New Guinea campaign, which included driving off a Japanese reinforcement fleet composed of destroyers and barges. Mid-1944 saw Admiral Crutchley's tour of duty end, and he was recalled to the United Kingdom, replaced by Commodore Collins. Australia remained tied to the New Guinea campaign until the autumn, when operations began heading towards the Philippines. She would receive her first true war damage supporting the landings at Leyte when a crippled Val dive bomber crashed into the foremast and sent fragments and fuel all over the bridge and forward superstructure. After repairs, she went back to supporting the liberation of the Philippines, and at the start of 1945, she would be hit by 5 kamikazes in quick succession, which cost her much of her trained anti-aircraft gun crews. This cumulative damage saw her head for home for repairs yet again, and she was given a major refit which removed the aircraft handling facilities as well as X-turret, and installed many 40mm Bofors. These efforts, and a voyage back to the United Kingdom to facilitate some of them, meant that she was still in refit when the war ended. Returning to Australia in early 1946, she was in and out of frontline service in the latter part of the 1940s, then mainly served as an active training vessel for the first part of the 1950s, before being taken out of service and sold for scrapping in 1954 and 55, with a few bits of her preserved at various locations around Australia to this day.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.